Welcome back to Doctrines 3 as we continue on with Angels, Church, and End Times. I want to conclude our study of Satanology with what will happen to Satan in the future. In other words, what will his judgment be like? We see this throughout Scripture. In fact, even at the very beginning, and we've already even seen this as we talked about the origin of Satan, that as soon as sin was discovered in Satan, iniquity was discovered in Satan, that he was cast out from God's presence in his exalted position. As the anointed cherub, Satan led a host of angels, possibly 1/3 of all the angels. We see that in Revelation chapter 12, from heaven in his fall. These became the demons. We'll see that next week when we start studying demonology. And though Satan still has an access to heaven, we see that in Job chapter 1 and 2. We also see it in Revelation chapter 12, that he is ever before the throne to accuse the brethren. His position has changed. He is no longer the exalted cherub. He no longer has that position and that favor with God. That does not mean that he does not have access to the throne. We see that he does continue to have that and will all the way up through Revelation chapter 12, when we see the end of that. We see in Genesis chapter 3, his defeat was pronounced. God informed Satan that even though he would have a minor victory, you shall bruise him on the heel, Christ will have ultimate victory over Satan in the cross. This is sometimes called the Protoevangelium, or the first mention of the gospel in Genesis 3:15. Now, we need to understand that the first mention of the gospel does not mean that somehow this verse entails forgiveness of sins or the atonement of Christ's death on the cross, but simply the fact that Christ would gain this victory by defeating the serpent who was in the garden. In this ultimate victory, that he shall bruise or he shall crush your head. Again, that judgment was pronounced in the garden, and ultimately he was rendered powerless through the cross itself. In the fulfillment of that prophecy, when Christ died on the cross and then rose again, Christ partook of that humanity at being the seed of the woman, and through that substitutionary death, he defeated Satan, crushing his head, rendering him impotent in the believer's life. Satan no longer has power. Jesus Christ even said on his way to the cross in the upper room that I have overcome the world. I have overcome Satan. Satan, he says, the God of this world is, past tense, now judged because of what Jesus was about to do on the cross. We see that Satan had the power of death over people, but that power was broken through Christ. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 4, O death, where is your sting? Because of what Christ did on the cross. Ultimately, Satan, while still having access to God and the throne, will lose that during the period of the tribulation. We'll see this in a few weeks when we get into our study of eschatology, that during the tribulation, at the midpoint of the tribulation, Satan will ultimately be cast out. And he will take with him at that point the third of the angels, and they will no longer have access to heaven, but rather will then take up residence here on this earth. And we see that casting out of heaven as an act of judgment in Revelation chapter 12, there at the midpoint of the tribulation. But even that is not his final judgment. In fact, that's actually, we kind of see Satan thinking I've actually won with that, because he indwells the Antichrist and rules over this earth for 3.5 years before the Battle of Armageddon, when Jesus returns in the glorious appearing. When Jesus comes back, however, Satan will be bound for 1,000 years in the pit, or the abyss. And again, we'll see a lot of this when we get into eschatology. During that 1,000-year period of the millennial kingdom, Satan will be bound and not only powerless, but inactive in the world during that 1,000-year period. When Christ returns, Satan is bound for 1,000 years and closed up in that abyss. He's no longer able to deceive anyone on earth for the duration of the millennial kingdom. Ultimately, then, after the 1,000 years, he will come back out. He'll be released, lead another rebellion, and at that point, after the great white throne judgment, Satan will be cast into the lake of fire, where he will spend all of eternity. Now, it's important to understand that after his release, he deceives many people. He's still active. He leads a rebellion against God, and finally cast in the lake of fire for all eternity. Now, when we get into eschatology, one of the first things we're going to recognize is that the lake of fire is hell. That currently hell does not exist. And that's a bit of a tease for when we get into eschatology. Satan is not the ruler of hell. Satan is the ruler of this world. He is the prince of the power of the air. He is roaming around freely on this earth, seeking whom he might devour. And so we need to recognize his power on this earth. But I want to finish up with one final illustration that was told to me, again, from a missionary. And it was of the missionary who had a snake that came into his house, one of those big anaconda snakes, 15-foot long python. I forget exactly what kind of snake it was. Really doesn't matter to the story. But he went into town. He found the guy that kind of deals with big snakes, and he came into the house with his machete, and he went in and cut the head off of the snake. And the missionary said, "Oh, great, now I can go back into my house. The snake has been killed." And of course, remember, Satan is called the serpent of old. He was first given a picture of being a serpent in the garden. When the guy cut off the head of the serpent, though, he told the missionary, "You're going to have to wait a day or so before you can go back into your house." The missionary says, "I don't understand. Why can't I go back into my house?" He says, "Well, because that's the thing it is with these really long snakes." He says, "When you cut off the head, it takes a while for the rest of the body to realize that it's dead." And sure enough, after a few days, the man came back to the missionary and said, "It's now safe to go back into your house." And when the missionary came in, he saw that the house had been torn apart by the body of the snake that didn't know that it had already been defeated. And so it is an illustration, not necessarily a perfect illustration, but I think it is definitely an appropriate situation that though Satan has been defeated, he is still very dangerous. Next week, when we talk about demonology, we'll talk about our role in spiritual warfare and how we should act and how we should work within that the spiritual warfare that Christ calls us to. That's all we have for Satanology. Look forward to seeing your comments in the discussion group.